Welcome to tonight's story, where we will delve deep into one of the most terrifying creatures from Irish mythology, the slua. These beings are not the kind to make deals or offer mercy. They are not fairies who may play tricks or banshees who simply wail to foretell death. No, the slua are far darker, far more relentless. They are the damned spirits, those who are so wicked in life that even the afterlife has rejected them. Cursed to roam the skies in a flock, they hunt for souls to drag into their eternal misery. In ancient times, the slua were believed to come from the west, carried on cold winds as a swarm of shadowy entities, their form ever shifting, resembling a great mass of birds or bats blotting out the moon. They would swoop down at the moment of death, spiriting away the souls of the dying or the unwary, often dragging them to an existence far worse than hell. Many would keep their westward-facing windows tightly sealed after dark, for it was said that to leave them open was to invite the slua into your home. Once inside, they would not leave without taking something, or someone, back with them. Some believe that the slua hunt the most sinful, while others say they simply devour whoever they come across. But everyone agrees on one thing. Once they choose their victim, there is no escape. Their screeching winds, the sound of many wings flapping in the black of night, and the sickening chill that accompanies them are all that most witnesses ever experience before the terror begins. Tonight, I'll share with you the harrowing tale of one man's encounter with these forsaken souls. A man who, despite all his skepticism, came face to face with the horror of the slua and learned the price of disbelief. It was a night like any other in the remote village of Cloncree, nestled deep in the Irish countryside, far from the bustling cities and even farther from anything resembling modern convenience. The year was 1901, and while many in the world had started to embrace technology and progress, Cloncree remained locked in the old ways. Superstitions were as much a part of life as the changing seasons. But for Eamon O'Shaughnessy, such beliefs were nothing more than relics of ignorance. Eamon was a farmer, and a good one. He worked his land from dawn until dusk, and laughed at the old wives' tales his neighbors whispered around the fires at night. Ghosts? Fairies? The slua? He dismissed them all as nonsense. Fear is for the weak-minded, he often said, pride in his practicality dripping from every word. His wife, Mairead, was far more cautious. She had grown up hearing stories from her grandmother, who swore she'd seen the slua swooping down from the hills, taking her cousin in the dead of night. They come when the wind blows cold from the west, she'd warn Eamon, eyes wide with dread. But Eamon would only chuckle. The nights had grown colder, and the western winds were blowing stronger with each passing evening. It was nearing Samhain, the time of year when the veil between the living and the dead was at its thinnest. But Eamon paid little attention to the date. To him, it was simply another time to work the land. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned a bruised shade of purple, Eamon returned from the fields, his hands calloused and his muscles aching. The air was heavy, the wind unusually fierce as it howled through the gaps in the stone walls of his farmhouse. Mairead was inside, lighting the fire and murmuring a quiet prayer under her breath. "You'll call down the slua with all that talk of spirits and curses," Eamon joked, hanging his coat by the door. Mairead's face paled. "You shouldn't mock what you don't understand," she whispered, glancing toward the small window facing west. "It's nights like this they come." Eamon rolled his eyes, but something in her tone gave him pause. "And what? They'll come flying through the door and drag me away?" He laughed, though the sound was hollow. Mairead didn't laugh. "I heard the wind earlier. It wasn't just the wind, Eamon, it was them." Eamon waved her off and poured himself a drink, the amber liquid calming his nerves as the wind howled outside, rattling the shutters. But as the night deepened, something began to gnaw at the back of his mind. The air felt wrong, heavy, oppressive, and there was a sharpness to the wind that hadn't been there before. Mairead had long since gone to bed, but Eamon found himself sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. He told himself it was simply the cold keeping him awake, but deep down, something else lingered, an unspoken fear, the kind that gnaws at your gut and refuses to leave. It was just after midnight when he first heard it. A distant sound carried on the wind. At first it was faint, barely discernible above the howling gusts, but slowly it grew louder, a rhythmic beating, like wings cutting through the air. Eamon sat up, straining to hear over the wind. At first it was faint, barely discernible above the howling gusts, but slowly it grew louder, a rhythmic beating, like wings cutting through the air. Eamon sat up, straining to hear over the wind. The sound was unmistakable now, a low, droning hum, like the beating of 1,000 wings. His heart quickened. "It's just birds," he muttered, though the words felt empty. But as the sound grew closer, he realized it wasn't birds. The beating was too irregular, too chaotic. And then, mingled with the wind, he heard it, the faintest echo of voices, whispering, screaming. A chorus of wails carried on the night air, growing louder and more desperate with each passing second. Eamon's mouth went dry. He stood from his chair and moved toward the window, peering out into the inky blackness. At first he saw nothing, just the shadows of trees swaying in the wind. But then, in the distance, something moved. A dark shape, shifting and writhing like a swarm of insects, blotting out the sky. His breath caught in his throat. The stories, they couldn't be real. It was impossible. And yet, there they were. The slua. The shadowy mass grew larger, twisting and turning as it approached the farmhouse. Eamon stumbled back from the window, his heart pounding in his chest. The stories had always described them as a flock of birds or bats, but this was worse. The slua were a swirling storm of souls, their twisted faces barely visible within the black cloud, mouths open in silent screams. Their eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed with a sickly green light. Eamon backed away from the window, his mind racing. "This can't be real," he whispered, but the words sounded weak, even to him. The wind outside grew fiercer, slamming against the walls of the house as the slua drew closer. And then suddenly, the wailing stopped. The air became eerily still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Eamon stood frozen, staring at the door. He could hear something scraping against the wood, a clawing, scratching sound like nails being dragged across the surface. His blood ran cold. Mairead's warnings echoed in his mind. They come when the wind blows cold from the west. For the first time in his life, Eamon felt true fear, the kind that grips you so tightly you can't breathe. He knew now that this was no myth, no old wives' tale. The slua were real, and they had come for him. The door rattled on its hinges, as if something was trying to force its way inside. Eamon stumbled backward, his eyes darting around the room. There had to be a way to stop them, to keep them out. But what? He had never believed in these things, never paid attention to the superstitions that his wife had clung to. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. Eamon backed into the kitchen, his hands trembling as he grabbed a kitchen knife from the table. It felt absurd, the cold steel in his hand, as if a simple blade could defend him from something as otherworldly as the slua. And then, without warning, the window shattered. The wind howled through the broken glass, and with it came the slua. They poured into the room like a living shadow, a mass of writhing darkness that filled every corner. The air grew thick with the stench of decay, and the temperature plummeted. Eamon fell to the floor, his knife clattering uselessly beside him. The slua swarmed around him, their twisted faces leering down from above, their glowing eyes burning into his soul. He could hear their whispers now, taunting, mocking, as they circled him. "You cannot escape us," they hissed, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of despair. "You are ours." Eamon's chest tightened as the air around him grew heavier. He tried to move, to crawl away, but his limbs felt like lead. The slua descended upon him, their cold, clawed hands wrapping around his arms, his legs, his throat. They were dragging him, pulling him toward the broken window. His screams were swallowed by the wind as the slua lifted him from the ground, carrying him toward the gaping maw of the night. His body convulsed with terror, his mind teetering on the edge of madness. This was it. They were going to take him, drag him into the darkness, into the unknown. Just as his body was about to be pulled out into the black abyss, something cut through the air, a sharp, clear sound like a bell ringing in the distance. The slua hesitated, their grip loosening ever so slightly. Eamon blinked, gasping for breath. He turned his head, his eyes searching for the source of the sound. And then he saw it. Mairead standing in the doorway, clutching a small iron cross in her hands. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, but her voice was steady as she began to recite an ancient prayer, one that had been passed down through her family for generations. The slua recoiled at the sound, their twisted forms writhing in agony. They released their hold on Eamon, retreating back toward the window. Their wails grew louder, more desperate. as they were forced back into the night by the power of the prayer. Eamon collapsed to the floor, his body trembling uncontrollably. Mairead rushed to his side, the iron cross still clutched tightly in her hand. Together they watched as the slua disappeared into the darkness, their haunting cries fading into the wind. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The house was silent, save for the crackling of the fire and the faint rustle of the wind outside. Eamon stared at the shattered window, his mind reeling from what he had just experienced. The slua were real. They were real, and they had almost taken him. Mairead's voice broke the silence. "I told you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I told you they were real." Eamon nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He had mocked the stories, dismissed the warnings, but now he knew better. The slua were not just a myth, they were a nightmare, and they were still out there waiting, watching, hunting for their next victim. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more terrifying tales from Irish folklore and beyond, don't forget to leave a comment, like the video, and subscribe to the channel. We've got plenty more spine-chilling legends to share with you, so hit that notification bell to never miss a new story. And remember, when the wind blows cold from the west, keep your windows shut. You never know what might be lurking outside. Thanks for watching.